Okay, we finished yesterday talking about democratic socialism. We'll talk about how it functioned in Canada. In Canada, democratic socialism mostly began during the Great Depression period in 1932. There was a particular political party. I don't know if they necessarily started off as a political party, but they were called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. Their goal was to provide shelter for the jobless and homeless, job creation programs, pensions for people who spent their lives working but couldn't be taken care of by their impoverished children, health services that would be subsidized by the government. So essentially what happens is, as society's progressing in the 1900s, after World War I, things are going very well for about 10 years, and then the Great Depression hits, all the markets collapse, there's not enough people to sell to, and there's too much product, all these people go broke. Okay, and it's not because they did anything wrong per se, as individuals. There may have been some government influence, but part of what happened is after World War I, about 15 years after World War I, the European markets had rebuilt themselves, so the European economy could function on its own without as much assistance from the rest of the world, particularly North America, which partially led to the Great Depression. And it's an important and valid question to ask, when you're doing everything right and just something terrible happens, how should the government respond, especially if it happens to everyone across the board? And should you be punished even though you were being diligent? Like, I'm sure there were some people who didn't prepare enough for tragedy to occur, but some people must have. Regardless, it dramatically affected everyone. Okay. So you have Tommy Douglas, who was the premier of Saskatchewan. In alliance with the CCF, he formed North America's first democratic socialist government. They created the New Democratic Party, the NDP party. Okay. And it's quite interesting to have seen what the NDP has done over the last 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years, particularly with the COVID situation and how they choose to either represent or not represent working class people. When the start of the NDP was based on assisting working class people. So particularly, you guys were mentioning Jagmeet Singh earlier, the NDP party at a national level, federal level, when the trucker protest was happening in Ottawa, they absolutely refused to go out and meet with people who were more or less, from a variety of reports, were peacefully protesting, particularly the ones in Ottawa outside the capital. What was going on the border, very different style of protest. I don't know as much about that, but the people who were parked outside Parliament in Ottawa simply wanted to discuss with the government a path forward. And it's not wrong to do that, but the Liberal and NDP parties completely refused to go out and discuss with them and to meet with them. Okay. Many of the Conservative Party members were dragged through the mud by the CBC for going out there and discussing with people and actually seeing what's the problem, what would you like done about it, what are some solutions, how has your experience been in the last 2 years? For many people who work regular, everyday working class jobs, they had all of their work and business shut down by government decisions and were essentially told to live off $2,000 a month, which wasn't free. That money will be returned through taxes, through debt collection on the country level. It's not like that money was just free and there was no strings attached to it. So while that is happening for working class people, the government is still being paid, despite the fact that they weren't sitting and meeting in Parliament, they weren't making decisions, they kept stalling out and just printing more money, which puts us in more of an economic hole than we began. So it's quite interesting when you learn about the history of the NDP party and who they were supposed to represent and how they started to shift over time.
So basically, Kiefer Sutherland's grandpa started the NDP, right?
Kiefer Sutherland?
Yep.
I don't know who that is.
Okay.
If he was from the CCF side, potentially, I don't know. I don't know all the significant figures, but Tommy Douglas played an important role. Particularly, Tommy Douglas was also the one behind establishment of universal health care in Canada. So he first starts this process of healthcare, of public healthcare in Saskatchewan, finds it to be successful, it's able to benefit more people, and then they take that local level and put it to the national level so that everyone can access healthcare, which obviously is a very beneficial thing for anyone who's ever had to go to the doctor for a need, right? Like you had a terrible leg injury a year ago, you didn't have to pay anything for that, more or less, for the surgery. Many people in America get bankrupted for having to go to the hospital. It can cost hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And not all of it is based off the actual price of the service and whatnot. A lot of online internet advice for Americans going through the healthcare system is to ask for itemized reports of everything they're paying for. I read this one person written online, like the nurse asked them, like, hey, do you want some Halls for your cough? And they thought it was complimentary. Found out on the bill that they were attempting to charge like $18 for Halls, which is absurd, right? So, there are some industries where you want to ask, should we run it for profit? Should we be trying to make $1 off of people's poor health and misfortune, especially when we're drinking this much sugar, consuming, a diet or lifestyle that isn't conducive to good health, right? The socialist response is, well, we should take care of everyone. The individualist response is, well, you should educate yourself and make better choices. In Quebec specifically, socialism takes place particularly after World War II. You have Premier Maurice Duplessis, however you say that. So initially the guy was very anti-communist, very anti-union. He was a promoter of laissez-faire economic policies. I want to say I got this stuff from the textbook, and the textbook doesn't necessarily bridge very well how he went from that to very left-wing. But in Quebec, the government plays a significant role in the lives of citizens. For example, again, I'm going to harp on this COVID situation quite a bit. How many of you are aware that in Quebec they had, what do they call them? Curfews. People couldn't leave their house after 8 p.m.
Yeah.
And if they did, they were given a fine. 8 p.m. is very early. Imagine you couldn't leave your house after that time. Who's the government to tell you when you can and cannot leave your house? I just recorded a little podcast interview with a friend yesterday, and his family's from China, and in China it's very terrible what they did. They would literally board people up into their house. They'd put wooden boards, they'd nail them into the wall, and people couldn't go in and out of their houses when they were locked down for COVID reasons. And again, if you look at the data for people who die from COVID, like again, if you look at people who didn't have other severe conditions or were very old, COVID was essentially killing people at less than 1% rate. Now, if you had other previous conditions, 2 or 3 of them, along with very old age, sure, COVID can be very rough, and it may have played a role in, finishing you off. But again, this idea of how much the government should interfere and play a role in the lives of citizens is the question behind socialism as well, particularly democratic socialism. Okay, some of the public work projects that are involved with a more collectivist governance is, building of roads and highways, schools, hospitals, public access centers, so even libraries as well. Okay, so once this guy Maurice Duplessis dies, that's when the rise to socialism begins. Okay, so maybe I had forgotten about the bridge. It's right there. Okay, it's also tied to the movement supporting Quebec's sovereignty. They had various Marxist groups, very extreme communist groups in Quebec. There's actually quite the communist society in Quebec. I remember when I was living there in Montreal, one of our friends who lived in the house with us, she was saying some guy she was dating is part of some communist group, and in their meetings they actually call each other comrades and whatnot. It's quite entertaining. Whether or not they actually get educated on how communism played out in reality, I would doubt. Many of them maybe hold the belief that, oh, well, if we were there at that time, we would have done better, which, again, I seriously doubt that as well. Okay. But again, this idea from Karl Marx, this oppressor-oppressed status, so many of the Quebec people felt like they were being oppressed by the Canadian federal government, which also plays a role in their desire to want to leave Federation. As time goes on, more and more political parties start adopting socialist values. Again, Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams speak on this quite a bit in their books and their work. And, I was chatting with a friend about this recently. She asked me to sign a petition that the NDP had raised for relieving student debt. And at the surface level, it sounds like a great idea. Deep down, they're essentially just buying people's votes, right? And what I'm referring to, student debt, is university loans, student loans. But, many political parties will simply buy votes by saying, hey, if you vote for us, we'll put in this social program. It'll give you a certain amount of money every month for XYZ issue. And some of it is necessary. Like, obviously, let's say you're a single parent and you need a bit of supplementary income because you have 1 or 2 children. To an extent, I don't know what should be done in regards to, do you want people who, for whatever reason, end up in a single parent household to just not have enough money to properly grow up, get enough food, have access to some of the same things that we have access to, privileges, let's say, like being able to play a sport. But a lot of what more left-wing socialist political movements can do is, they'll buy votes through social programs. And again, Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams talk about the effectiveness of these programs and talk about how the problems either persist or increase. Particularly, they both talk about how these problems in the black community in America, the government will blame it on the what is the other one? It's the Democrats and the Republicans. They'll say, oh, well, the Republicans in America, there's a lot of racism, institutional racism. But then, when they analyze the policies, they find out, well, actually the people on the side who are pointing the finger of racism put in certain policies to financially help, black Americans. What it actually ends up doing is hurting them over the long run. Anyways, things like providing greater access to healthcare, education, obviously that's it's a privilege. It's a massive privilege to have the ability to be educated, although, looking around, you wouldn't believe it. It is a privilege to have access to healthcare professionals who are qualified to look at you and make sure you're okay, to get various tests done to make sure, you don't have cancer or some sort of disease, tumors, to be able to get surgeries, fixing up your bones and whatnot. Okay. Other forms of socialism and separatism in Quebec, the Parti Québécois has always been more or less the movement behind wanting to separate from Canada. Okay. An embracing of socialist values. So again, government stepping into your life as an older brother and taking care of problems for you, potentially, that either you can't solve or won't solve, or for whatever set of reasons feel as if they should solve for you. There's a little quote here. So the real degree of a civilization is shown to us by the treatment of the disadvantaged people, mainly the elderly, defenseless children, the handicapped, families with many children on a modest income. Okay. There's examples of some of the policies they introduced to take care of people. Okay, last slide, chapter summary. What can we take away from this? So, many people took many different routes in their response to the shortcomings of classical liberalism, capitalism. Many were not happy with the economic inequality created by these systems and therefore decided the only response was to revolt. Others appreciated the potential for prosperity within capitalism but realized there needed to be a I don't know what I'm supposed to be saying there. Anyways, they needed a ethical response to attempt to take care of the people beneath us, right? For a variety of reasons, when you leave people to their own devices, some people will do well and some people will not. Okay, part of that can be culture, right? It can be whatever culture you're a part of. So let's say, particularly with a smaller group of people on a team, if you have a culture that says, okay, 3:30, everybody shows up to the gym, they're changed, they're ready to go for practice, and at 3:35, that's when practice begins with warm-up. Okay, that's going to be a very timely culture, right? And different coaches have different philosophies. So when I played basketball in high school, practice started at 3:30. Didn't mean we got changed at 3:30. We were there ready to go at 3:30. Okay, and that impacts the way practice and coaching flows, right? Same thing with a classroom. Whatever you allow starts becoming part of the culture, or a school. And sometimes cultures get hijacked, like clearly our society is being hijacked by technology and cell phones. Or nap time, right? But if you're napping, that's okay, because you need your sleep, and you're probably not getting your sleep at night because you're on your phone. Right? He's not denying it.
Yeah, same here.
Right? So our culture can dictate a lot about our success and our future. Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams talk about this extensively. I was also listening to a podcast the other week about this. This private school in America, what they noticed is that prior to 13, you can really integrate a child into a culture. So let's say you have a culture of working hard. Prior to 13, so you get this kid at 6, they'll integrate into that. But after something happens around puberty where people start seeing more differences in their personality, and if they were to get a student who is 14, 15, 16 into their school, while they're at the school, they may be very industrious and productive, but they won't do that on their own because they're not part of that culture. So again, that culture really reinforces some of this, how you behave, or what you condone. So for example, in Canada, particularly many, like in the West, North America for sure, how many of you sitting in a class have ever been taught how to balance a budget? So meaning how much money you earn in a month and how much you spend. I'm assuming.
Did we do that in common?
I'm assuming no one's raising their hand because you haven't really been taught that in an effective manner.
Oh,
Right?
we kind of talked about it.
Yeah, we did.
A little bit.
Okay, so some of you paid attention, some of you didn't.
Oh,
Generally speaking though, most students leave high school, they don't feel like they were actually taught economics properly. Like, how do you actually manage your own money? And so what do you think that does to the culture 5, 10, 15 years down the road? You have a lot of people who are in debt. They don't have enough money. They're living paycheck to paycheck. It's like, hot take for the camera. It's like you're not quite a slave, but you really have no choice. Like if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you have all of your expenses, amen, always. You both going? What's up? You're both going?
Yeah, we're heading past Calgary for hockey.
Okay. Yes. It's 2:45.
What time is it now?
Okay, the last point here is that if we're going to do something with government involvement, it should be democratic. It should be decided by the majority of people, not just a small group. Everybody should get the opportunity to vote. At least you have a choice then. Okay, and that ends that. Thank you very much.